Hello, and welcome to Voice of the Disabled, brought to you by Adaptive Chicago Productions and hosted by the CAN TV studio here in Chicago. I'm Joel Margolis, your host, and with me today are two guests. On my right is Ms. Cathleen O'Brien, representing the organization Access Living, and to her right, directly across from me, is Ms. Helena Duncan of the Lift the Ban movement. Cathleen, let me start with you. For the benefit of our viewers who are not familiar with Access Living, what is Access Living and what does it do?
Access Living is a Center for Independent Living and Disability Advocacy organization in Chicago. It was founded in 1980. We provide a lot of different services to disabled people, including legal services, independent living services, and advocacy services. For my part at Access Living, I organize a group of people who either live in or need affordable, accessible housing to advocate for more affordable, accessible housing at the city level, the state level, and sometimes nationally. Although for most of the time I've been at Access Living, Donald Trump was president, so we haven't worked nationally in a while. So most of my work has been advocating for city and state laws that would create affordable, accessible housing.
And Helena, you work for Lift the Ban. We've heard the word ban in a variety of different contexts. What is Lift the Ban in your context?
Sure. So Lift the Ban is a coalition of organizations in Chicago and across the state of Illinois fighting for rent control. And we're called Lift the Ban because rent control is currently banned in Illinois, as well as many other states. Here in Illinois in 1997, the real estate lobby and the right-wing lobbying group ALEC, American Legislative Exchange Council, got together and instituted a ban on rent control, so no municipality anywhere in the state can enact any policy that would limit rents. So we're trying to get out of that ban so we can win rent control for our communities.
I understand. Now, when we speak about disabled individuals and the housing markets, I think many people might be confused as to exactly what are the rights of the disabled individual vis-a-vis the housing markets. At the present time, is discrimination against the disabled in the housing market something mandated by federal law, or does it have local laws as well, Cathleen?
So disabled people were added as a protected class to the Fair Housing Act in 1988. So we have had those protections since 1988. It's illegal as a landlord to say, I'm not renting to you because you have a disability. However, the thing is that the average rent in Chicago for a two-bedroom apartment is about $1,400. And the average income for someone on a disability who gets SSI or SSDI for an individual person is about $791. So they don't really have to say that they're not renting to you because you're disabled, because you just plain cannot afford it. Now, there are ways you can get get help to rent an apartment. Like there are housing choice vouchers, which are subsidies that allow you to rent in private markets, but those have really, really long waiting lists. It's sort of like getting a golden ticket. And then when you get those, landlords are allowed in a lot of municipalities in Illinois to deny you based on that. So that is why we've been advocating for a bill called HB 2775 to make it illegal in Illinois to say that you will not accept housing choice vouchers. It's why we advocate for things like rent control. It's why we advocate at the city level to make the CHA do its job and actually utilize all its vacant units, because it's one of the only housing options that people with disabilities have in the city. And for a city that complains about having a lack of resources, we're not even utilizing all the ones that we do have. So it speaks to a lot of our work. We are protected since 1988, but it doesn't matter if you don't have the money.
Now, is the Fair Housing Act the only legal protection that disabled individuals have vis-a-vis the housing markets? That's a federal legislation, correct?
So all the protections are federal. The 504 Rehabilitation Act says that 5% of new construction has to be accessible, not even totally usable by people in wheelchairs, but basically visitable, and that 2% have to be usable by blind and deaf folks. However, the Fair Housing Act is the only protection we have against discrimination. The problem with the 504, even though it was a very good law when it was passed at the time and is still very important, is that way more than 5% of the population is disabled. So like one of our dream things to get passed at the federal level, which we should probably build a national coalition around, is to make the 504 requirements comply with the American Census data, and actually make enough, build enough housing for the population.
You say comply with the census data. What does the census data tell us about the disabled?
I don't have it completely memorized, but it would be around 20% would need, because you have to factor in that most seniors have a disability too. So it would be around 20% of new construction would need to be at least visitable by people. And, you know, Helena is going to talk about the importance of rent control. And another thing we could do that wouldn't raise the rent is just to have a national home mods fund. Because then it wouldn't be required to be new construction. You could widen doors, build ramps, things like that. It wouldn't gentrify areas, make the rent go up, right? But if you had a national home mods fund, you could make a lot of these old apartments usable by disabled people without raising the rents too.
I see.
So there's a lot of ways we could go about this, but we have to do something.
Okay. However, trying to put some limits on rent is one of those ways. Helena, you speak about a statewide ban on rent control. Where did this statewide ban come from? Where did it originate? And is it found in many other states?
Yes, so currently a majority of states have some sort of rent control preemption in place. It was a campaign by the American Legislative Exchange Council and its corporate real estate clientele. Beginning in the 80s, they started to look at some places that were enacting rent control, and they wanted to protect their profits and started instituting these bans. So in 1997, Illinois had a rent control ban. Since then, of course, we've seen rents skyrocket, but there's nothing we can do to stabilize rents, to regulate them. Now, rent control is just a policy that says that your landlord can't raise your rent more than a certain amount at the end of your lease, right? It's not a rent cap or a rent ceiling. It just stabilizes the rate of the increase, so people can stay in their homes, can have stability in their communities.
I see. Now, you spoke about this coming from both the real estate lobby and from a group called ALEC. That is the American Legislative Exchange Council, I believe. Okay. Are they actually a group concerned with housing?
No, they are a group concerned with their corporate clients. So ALEC is also responsible, for example, for stand your ground laws, like the law that enabled Trayvon Martin's killer to get away with it. They are responsible for laws that weaken environmental protections, that weaken our unions, that attack abortion access. So this is a group that writes model legislation. They call it model bills. You can go on their website and you can find the model text for the Rent Control Preemption Act, the ban in Illinois. It is the exact same text as the ban that we have in place. The law was literally copied and pasted from this group. So you talk about corporate interests that are writing our policy. I mean, that's literal in this case.
So ALEC in this place played a pivotal role in implementing that particular ban on rent control in Illinois.
Absolutely.
I understand. Now, rent control is often a rather heated topic in a variety of places. For instance, the criticism is constantly made in New York that rent control discourages the production of new rental housing. What does your group say in response to that?
Sure. So that's a pretty common myth that the real estate lobby likes to trot out, is that rent control is going to decrease the amount of new housing that is built. And I think a good comparison is when you look at minimum wage increases. So 10 years ago, as Seattle was raising its minimum wage, corporations were saying, and economists were saying, this is going to be a disaster. It's going to have the opposite effect that's intended. It's going to make it so that fewer people have jobs. And you look at it now, and that didn't happen. There was no correlation between raising the minimum wage and people losing their jobs. And it's a similar thing with housing, where we're told all of this fear-mongering about how people aren't going to want to invest or to build new housing. And in reality, it isn't backed up by studies to show that new construction is in any way related to the presence or absence of rent control in a certain municipality.
So actually, ALEC is therefore pushing a line which does not have a real basis in fact when it comes to rent control and housing.
That's our position, that they, as a lobbying group with corporate clients whose interests they are promoting, they're promoting the bottom line of wealthy realty companies that to be able to price gouge. Some members of our coalition are mobile home residents in mobile home communities throughout Illinois. There was a community in Peoria where the mobile home residents, they rent the land that their home sits on. And this community in Peoria, the mobile home park raised their rent by 60%.
Not 16, but 60% at one time.
60% at one time. And people receiving these notices, they say, well, how is this not illegal? And in fact, it would be illegal to enact rent control currently.
And I just want to point out, for disabled people, because accessible units are often in very, very expensive buildings, disabled people rent at the top of their budget. So even a $10 increase in rent can mean that they have to move because it's the only accessible, safe place they can find. So a 60% increase would mean not only would they have to move, but they would find no other place. And that's true for everybody that Helena talks about, but for our community especially, because they often compromise other things in order to find an accessible place, because accessible places are in these newer buildings that are way too expensive.
Okay. Now, if indeed the ban on rent control is lifted, okay, does that mean, Helena, that any municipality or county in Illinois can simply enact rent control the next month? Is it that simple, or is there more involved than that?
It's not quite that simple. So the legislation that our coalition is pushing right now, it's House Bill 116, and our legislation would enable municipalities or communities to opt out of the rent control ban through a binding ballot referendum. So if voters go to the polls and they say, we want the ability to enact rent control, and they vote that way, which we think that they will, then that community or that municipality would be opted out of the ban, and they could craft a rent control ordinance suitable for that area. So we're calling it the Democracy in Rental Housing Act, and it's pretty simple that voters should have the right to decide what kind of housing policy they want to see.
I see. And with regard to the question of the disabled in housing exclusively for themselves as opposed to housing in the general rental market, Kathleen, does Access Living take a position on programs such as the 811 program, which builds housing exclusively for the disabled, i.e. a building full of disabled people?
I think it's more ideal for disabled people to live in the community. We've seen institutional settings become bastions of neglect, and it's more ideal for people with disabilities to be in communities with disabled and non-disabled people.
So as to integrate the disabled into the
Right.
general population.
I also think, too, to that point, that's why we need to fight for policies like rent control, because the PCAs, the personal care assistants that make it possible to stay in our home, are mostly people of color who make $22,000 a year. And those people need rent control, too. So this game that these legislators play to pit poor people against each other, we need to stop that. We are in coalition together, and we are fighting for these good policies, these good housing policies together.
Okay. You mentioned PCAs, personal care attendants or personal care assistants. Could you tell us a little bit more about them and how they fit into housing for the disabled?
Personal care attendants are people who help disabled people with activities of daily living. And so they might get a disabled person up, they might help them get dressed, they might help them with, they might even just help them keep their house clean. But they make it possible for them to stay in the community. And I will say, too, just to make this one step closer, a lot of them are family members of the disabled person. And a lot of people who are disabled in Chicago live on the south and west sides of Chicago. Their entire support systems need rent control in order to stay in their homes. And so just separating disabled people from other people who need rent control is not going to work anymore. We're not going to be, it's not different. Everybody needs rent to stay at a reasonable rate. Every renter.
And that, as they say, is the bottom line.
Yeah. I mean, what renter wants their rent to go up?
Okay. I'd like to ask both of you, with regard to the question of new housing, does either of your organization have proposals as to how to more effectively stimulate new rental housing at a reasonable cost? Or is this not an area where you get involved?
I guess I don't see. If your goal is to build housing that people can stay in, I don't know why new housing necessarily has to be built. I guess I don't have faith that the real estate lobby's real goal is to build housing that people can stay in. It's just to make money, as much money as they can possibly make, because if your goal is to build housing that people can stay in, then the current housing can stay at reasonable rates, and the new construction cannot be built, and you don't have to charge. You know, I live in Logan Square. There are studios that cost $1,800 a month. That's, what are you paying? Like, is it gold? Like, what are you paying for? So I guess if you're building housing, if your real goal is to house people, then I don't know why it has to be so unreasonable.
I understand. Okay. Now, with regard to the question of the disabled in the housing markets and their financial needs, their financial difficulties, okay, do you also concern yourselves with the issue of landlords who are hostile to, either openly or in disguised fashion, to individuals receiving subsidy in order to live, regardless of the source of subsidy?
Yes. I mean, that's why we're working on that source of income bill. Of course, when it becomes illegal, which we hope it will, landlords will still be hostile.
Could you tell us more about the source of income bill?
Well, it would make it a violation of the Illinois Human Rights Act to discriminate based on source of income. So source of income could be a housing choice voucher. Source of income could be cash, like waitresses have to pay, like musicians have to pay.
It could be, in effect, a variety of different sources. Okay.
And I will point out that landlords, we've spoken to a lot of landlords who are like, what about illegal sources of income? First of all, we're not advocating for that. And secondly, landlords don't ask where rich people's money come from, or I've never heard of them doing that.
And not every rich person has come by their money legally.
Right, that's what I'm saying.
I understand.
And
Helena,
I'll add to Kathleen's point that it's not an either, the housing crisis, and particularly with rental housing, is not either or. It's not either enact rent control or build more affordable, accessible housing. It has to be all of that and more. The groups that are in our coalition are also fighting for other policies, such as just cause for eviction, which is a city ordinance that would require your landlord to have a legitimate reason for kicking you out of your home. For other policies that really all need to be enacted quickly and in tandem if we're going to get a hold of this crisis, which statewide 47% of all renter households are paying more than a third of their income on rent.
I'd like to make sure we're clear on this. Statewide, you said more than...
So 47% of all Illinois renter households pay more than a third of their income on rent, which is called rent burden.
That is a burden indeed. I don't think we have any doubt on that. Now, in your work with Lift the Ban here in Illinois, are you in contact with other state-level organizations to enable rent control in their states?
I think more of that collaboration can and should be done. We've been on a couple calls recently with groups in New York who pushed a historic rent control legislation a couple of years ago to expand rent control rights there. And groups in California, of course, in their fight for rent control. It was so encouraging to see Oregon become the first state to pass statewide rent control last year or the year before. So absolutely, this is something that is going to be relevant for every state, because there are people who are rent burdened in every state, and housing markets that you might not think are going to become unaffordable, and before you look again, it's already become unaffordable for the people who live there. Okay,
so the housing market can change fairly rapidly.
Absolutely, and I think I was reading something by Janet Smith, who works at University of Illinois at Chicago and is an economist there, and she was saying that if a place like Logan Square had rent control 10 years ago, it might look a lot different than it does now. So I think it's good to think of rent control also as a prescriptive measure. It's not just reacting to places that have become unaffordable, but it can help preserve them for the future.
Okay. So in other words, rent control should not be seen as something that's reacting only to problems that have accumulated, but in effect anticipating problems that may come?
Absolutely.
I think we hear that loud and clear. Okay. Cathleen, in your work at Access Living, in addition to the issues you've described, could you tell us a little bit more about other aspects of housing at Access Living and other things you do in addition to the issues we've already mentioned?
Me personally, or?
Access Living is an organization.
So Access Living has housing counselors who work with folks to help them get housing. So it's a very hard and thankless job, because as we've discussed, about 1% of the housing stock in Chicago is both affordable and accessible. So she works very, very hard to find needles in haystacks for folks.
What are some of the things that a housing counselor does on a day-to-day basis vis-a-vis the disabled?
So people are on a very long waiting list to see her. When they see her, she works to help them get on waiting lists for housing. She works to set up appointments for them to go see housing. There's a lot that for people with cognitive disabilities, it's a very challenging process. So she helps them combat that. We used to have a program, and we're trying to get it back, where we had gotten attrition vouchers from the CHA. So if people died or turned their voucher back, those vouchers were given to Access Living. And we hope to get that back, so we were able to give a few vouchers to people. But now we are working to get that program back. So she does that. We have lawyers who help people. Who feel like they've been discriminated against by landlords because they're disabled.
Lawyers who help with things such as file a grievance or even file a suit, for instance?
Usually we offer fair housing training first, and if that does not go well, then yes, there are suits filed.
What exactly is fair housing training? What does that consist of?
So the landlord would attend trainings about disability rights and what is the right of a disabled tenant and what they are not allowed to do as landlords.
Now, when we speak about the disabled vis-a-vis the housing market, so far we've been talking about issues such as cost, i.e. simply paying the rent, okay? Mm-hmm. In addition, does Access Living become at all involved in working with architects or those in the construction industry to facilitate housing which is better adapted to the needs of the disabled?
I don't think we facilitate it. I think we know architects who know how to build universal design. We don't develop housing.
You don't develop it yourself, okay?
I will say something we forgot to cover, which I would like to cover, is no matter your disability, even if it's invisible, so you have a mental health disability, for example, it's very hard to find housing because landlords discriminate against you for that too. And that is where rent control comes in, because a lot of those folks are underemployed or unemployed and can't really ask to be accommodated in the same way, and it's harder for them to get vouchers, things like that. And so a lot of them rent market rate housing because they don't want to identify, because it's less likely for a landlord to rent to them. So I do just want to mention folks with mental health disabilities
who are also part of the disabled community.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right.
I think that both of you have provided us with a great deal of useful, insightful, and in some cases very revealing information about the situation of the disabled with regard to housing. I want to thank both of you for coming to Voice of the Disabled today. You, Helena Duncan, and you, Cathleen O'Brien, for sharing your knowledge and your insights with us. And to all of you who have tuned in today, I would like to thank you for joining us today, and hope that you will join us again for other episodes of Voice of the Disabled, brought to you by ADAPT of Chicago Productions and hosted by CAN TV here in Chicago. We hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're entirely welcome, and thank you for joining us.